Darkness has texture when it becomes absolute. I learned this in the hold of their ship, suspended in something that might have been metal or might have been bone. I could not tell, and the not knowing was itself a kind of wound. The blackness pressed against my eyes like thumbs, patient and deliberate, until I understood that sight was a privilege I had lost. But loss implies you once possessed something, and I was beginning to suspect I had never truly owned anything at all. The ship moved. I felt it in my bones before I heard it, a vibration that was wrong in ways I lacked words to describe. It was not the rumble of imperial engines or the grinding of voidcraft traversing real space. This was smooth, liquid, like sliding through the throat of something immense and still living. The webway, I would later learn it was called, though in that moment I had no name for the passage between realities, only the sensation of being swallowed. Then came the hands. They touched my skin with a curiosity that made my stomach turn. Not rough, not gentle, but exploratory in the way a butcher might assess meat or an artist might test canvas. Fingers too long, joints that bent in places human joints should not bend, nails that caught on my uniform and drew lines across my chest without breaking skin. Not yet. The restraint was somehow worse than violence would have been. It suggested patience, planning. The hands withdrew, and I heard laughter in the darkness. Bright, musical, utterly devoid of anything I recognized as joy. The smell came next. Ancient was my first thought, though that word carried none of the rot or decay I expected from age. This was the smell of something that had survived when it should have died, that had learned to feed on wrongness itself, that had breathed recycled air for so many millennia that its lungs no longer remembered what real atmosphere tasted like. Beneath it, sharper, chemicals I could not name, fluids that might have been blood but smelled like exotic oils, and under everything, the faint metallic tang of pure, distilled suffering. My mind tried to retreat into memory, to find safety in the moment before. I had been on Hadris Prime, a factory world, nothing special. I was Guardsman 3rd Class Victor Mezan, assigned to perimeter watch on the Northern Manufacturum District. Third watch. The sky had been its usual orange-gray, choked with refinery smoke. My laser gun had been freshly blessed by Commissar Volk just that morning, the prayer oil still slick on the barrel. I remember thinking about my ration chit, about whether the commissary would have fresh recaf or only the recycled sludge. Then the sky tore open. Not metaphorically. The air simply split, edges curling back like burned parchment, and through the wound came shapes moving faster than my eyes could track. I raised my laser gun, training, instinct, desperation, and fired into the blur of motion that was already past me, around me, through me. I saw Mikhail's head separate from his body with surgical precision. No lash wound or blade visible, just the sudden geometry of disconnection. I heard Sergeant Cross begin a prayer to the Emperor that ended mid-word, replaced by a sound I will carry forever, a scream that discovered new octaves at both ends of human vocal range. I turned. I fired. I screamed orders or prayers or obscenities. I cannot remember which. And then there was a sensation like being grabbed by the root of my spine and yanked backward through a hole in space that should not have existed. And the last thing I saw of my world was the Northern Manufacturum burning with flames that were the wrong color. And the last thing I heard was laughter that made my ears bleed. Then, the hold, the darkness, the hands, the smell, the understanding dawning like a slow poison that I was no longer in the galaxy I knew. Light came eventually, flickering and purple-green, bioluminescent things growing in patterns along walls that curved in dimensions my mind rejected. In that diseased radiance, I saw them clearly for the first time. Faces, but the word felt inadequate. These were sculptures of cruelty, features so sharp they looked like they could cut, skin so pale it seemed translucent, revealing the network of veins beneath like dark rivers on a map of damnation. Eyes that held no white, only depthless pools of darkness broken by pinprick pupils that dilated with something that might have been hunger or might have been aesthetic appreciation. I could not tell the difference. Their mouths curved in expressions that mimicked smiles the way a corpse mimics sleep. One leaned close enough that I could count the thousands of tiny scars decorating their face like calligraphy, each one deliberate, each one placed with the precision of a master craftsman signing their work. They spoke, and though I did not know their language, I understood the tone perfectly. The voice of a gourmand discussing a rare delicacy, of a collector appraising a new acquisition, of a torturer selecting the first instrument from a well-loved kit. I tried to speak, to demand, to threaten, to beg, but my throat produced only a sound like tearing paper, and the creature's smile widened, revealing teeth that had been filed or grown into points. That was when I understood. Mercy was not a word these beings had forgotten. They had never learned it. It did not exist in their philosophy the way color does not exist to the blind. I was not a prisoner of war. I was not a hostage for ransom. I was not even a slave in any sense I understood slavery. I was something else entirely, something for which the Munitorum field manual had no classification, no protocol, no recommended response. I was meat that could scream, and in the hold of that ship, sliding through passages between realities toward a destination I could not imagine, I felt the last comfortable lie of my existence dissolve. That the Emperor protected, that righteousness mattered, that the universe cared whether I lived or died with dignity. The darkness pressed closer. The hands returned. And somewhere ahead, a city waited that had been feeding on screams since before humanity learned to walk upright. The ship shuddered, and I felt the wrongness of the webway travel cease, replaced by a different wrongness entirely. We had arrived somewhere, though arrived suggests a journey with beginning and end, and I was learning that such concepts were luxuries of the sane world I had left behind. The hold opened, not with mechanical sounds of doors or ramps, but with a wet, tearing noise, as if the vessel itself had decided to birth us into whatever waited outside. They dragged me out by the chains they had wrapped around my wrists, metal so cold it burned, and I saw the city for the first time. My mind tried to make sense of it using the only vocabulary I possessed. I had seen hive cities on Hadris Prime, towers climbing toward polluted skies, structures built atop structures until the weight of civilization pressed down on those below. I had seen imperial architecture, all Gothic spires and buttresses, every angle designed to remind you of your smallness before the Emperor's grandeur. I had even seen picked captures of forge worlds, where machinery and habitation blurred into one endless mechanism. This was none of those things. This was something my eyes reported, but my brain refused to accept. The streets curved upward, not gradually, not following the sensible geometry of ramps or inclines, but impossibly defying every law of gravity and reason I had been taught. Buildings climbed in directions that hurt to observe, twisting through angles that should not exist, supported by nothing visible yet standing for what must have been eternities. Some structures appeared to be built from stone or metal, but others, and here my stomach clenched, others were clearly organic. Towers that breathed, bridges that pulsed, walkways made from substances that glistened like exposed muscle, veined and terrible. The sky above was not a sky. I understood this immediately, though understanding brought no comfort. It was darkness, yes, but darkness with texture, with depth, with the sense that if you stared too long, you would see things moving in it that should not move, geometries folding in on themselves, spaces between spaces where reality had given up trying. Occasionally, lights appeared in that false heaven, not stars, but something closer to bioluminescent growths or distant fires, purple and green and colors that had no names in Low Gothic. They provided illumination without warmth, light without hope. My captors pulled me forward, and I stumbled through streets that seemed to shift underfoot, never quite solid, always slightly wrong in texture and temperature. We entered what I could only describe as a market, though that word suggests commerce and order, and this place had neither in any form I recognized. The market sprawled across multiple levels, some higher, some lower, some existing in spatial relationships that made my head ache to perceive. Stalls and cages and display areas stretched in every direction, and in them I saw the livestock, beings from worlds I had never imagined. Humans, yes, dozens, hundreds perhaps, in various states of despair and modification. I saw a woman whose skin had been replaced with something translucent, her organs visible and still functioning, her eyes tracking movement with horrible clarity. I saw a man suspended in a crystal prison, aged to ancient years on one side of his body, young as a child on the other, the division razor-sharp down his center line. I saw children. The Emperor forgive me. I saw children, being inspected by creatures whose interest was clinical, aesthetic, anything but merciful. But there were others too. Xenospecies I had no names for. Something with too many limbs and eyes like orbital lenses. A creature that might have been reptilian, or might have been something else entirely, its scales reflecting light that was not present. A being made entirely of geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, contained in a cage that seemed to exist partially outside normal space. All of them waiting. All of them doomed. The beings who walked the market as buyers and sellers moved with a grace that was almost painful to observe. They were beautiful, I realized with revulsion. Beautiful the way a knife is beautiful, the way poison can be beautiful, the way a perfectly composed painting of atrocity can still demonstrate mastery of technique. Their armor and clothing shifted between functionality and decoration so seamlessly that I could not tell where protection ended and aesthetics began. Every surface was etched, carved, decorated with patterns that suggested screaming faces or writhing bodies, or abstract representations of suffering elevated to high art. I watched one transaction and began to understand the economy of this place. A buyer, tall, aristocratic, wearing armor that seemed to be made from solidified darkness, approached a seller who had 3 humans chained to a rack. The buyer did not inspect them for health or strength. Instead, they touched each captive's face, their neck, their chest, and I saw something happen. The captives screamed, not from pain but from something being drawn out of them, something essential, and the buyer's eyes flickered with satisfaction or disappointment, depending on the quality of what they tasted. The transaction completed with an exchange of crystalline vials containing substances that glowed with inner light, and I understood. Pain was currency here. Suffering was trade goods. Terror was commodity. Beauty and cruelty were not opposites in this place. They were the same thing viewed from different angles. A sculpture made from still living bone, a tapestry woven from hair that still grew, a musical instrument that used vocal cords instead of strings. Everything was crafted with such exquisite skill, such obvious mastery of technique, that my aesthetic sense warred with my horror until both became indistinguishable. Then I saw the homunculus. I had no word for what it was then, only the image. A figure that had been Eldari once, perhaps. but had decided that the original form was merely a starting point, a rough draft to be endlessly revised. Its body was a manifesto written in flesh, every limb extended or multiplied, every joint redesigned, skin replaced with substances that served function over comfort. It moved through the market like a master craftsman through their workshop, pausing to examine the merchandise with tools that grew directly from its fingers, making notations in a language written in scarification on its own arms. When it passed near me, it stopped, turned, regarded me with eyes that had been replaced by something better, lenses grown from organic material, magnifying and analyzing. It reached out with fingers that split into surgical implements at the tips and touched my jaw, tilting my head to catch the sick light better. It spoke to my captors in a voice like breaking glass arranged into melody, and though I did not understand the words, I understood the tone. Professional interest. The voice of someone who has seen a particularly interesting raw material, who can already envision what it might become with proper application of skill and vision and time. That was when the final truth settled into my bones. This was not a prison. Prisons punish. Prisons contain. Prisons exist to maintain order in societies that value law. This was a civilization, ancient and thriving, built on foundations I was only beginning to comprehend. Here, suffering was not punishment for transgression. It was art, religion, sustenance, the fundamental principle around which an entire culture organized itself. The homunculus released my face and moved on, already losing interest, and I was dragged deeper into the city that drank screams and never ever slept. They brought me to a chamber that might have been beautiful if your definition of beauty had been carefully extracted and replaced with something older and more honest. The walls were not walls, but membranes, semi-translucent, backlit by bioluminescence that pulsed in rhythm with something I could not identify. A heartbeat, perhaps, or the breathing of the city itself. The floor was smooth and sloped toward drains that I tried not to think about. In the center of the room stood a framework of blades and hooks and restraints, arranged with the precision of surgical equipment or religious iconography, depending on how you chose to interpret it. I was strapped to this framework with efficiency that suggested long practice. The restraints were not crude chains, but something more sophisticated. Thin cables that tightened in response to struggle, learning the boundaries of my resistance and adjusting accordingly. My arms were spread, wide, legs positioned shoulder-width apart, head held immobile by a brace that smelled of old leather and older blood. The position was uncomfortable but not yet agonizing, which somehow made it worse. It suggested that discomfort was not the point. Discomfort was merely the canvas upon which the actual work would be painted. She entered without sound, and I understood immediately that this was a she, though the markers of gender were expressed differently here, through movement and presence rather than biology. She was Eldari, slender and deadly, wearing armor that consisted mostly of blades arranged to protect while simultaneously threatening. Her hair was the white of sun-bleached bone, pulled back in a style that was both functional and decorative, woven with small hooks that caught the light. Her skin bore ritual scars, not wounds, but deliberate patterns that suggested membership in something, allegiance to philosophies I could not name. She circled me once, twice, 3 times, studying me from every angle with eyes that reflected no light. Her expression was not cruel. That would have been almost comforting, cruelty implying emotion, and emotion implying some shared humanity. Instead, her face held the calm focus of a craftsman about to begin a familiar task, the slight anticipation of someone who enjoys their work and takes pride in doing it well. She spoke, and though I still did not understand the language, the tone was almost conversational. explaining something perhaps, describing the process, narrating her intentions with the casual confidence of a lecturer addressing students. She selected an instrument from a rack I had not noticed, something curved and slender, edge so fine it seemed to end in nothing, and held it up to the light, checking for imperfections the way my old sergeant used to check his officer's blade before dress inspection. The first cut was so precise I did not feel it happen. I only knew when I saw the blood, my blood, running down my chest in a line so straight it might have been drawn by architectural instruments. The pain arrived a heartbeat later, sharp and clean, and I gasped but did not scream. Not yet. Some part of my pride remained, some final remnant of my training that insisted guardsmen do not break easily, that the Emperor's soldiers endure. She paused, tilted her head, made a notation on a device embedded in her forearm, organic technology that pulsed with faint light. She was recording, measuring, studying my response the way a medicae might study a patient's reflexes, clinical and thorough. The second cut was deeper, angled differently, placed with deliberate precision, 2 finger widths from the first. This time I cried out. Not a scream, not yet, but a sound that hurt my throat on the way out. She leaned closer, watching not my wound but my face, my eyes, cataloging the exact expression of pain I produced. I saw her pupils dilate slightly, saw color flood her cheeks, saw her breathing quicken just barely. She was feeding, not on my flesh or blood, but on something else. The exquisite moment of suffering distilled to its purest form, absorbed through senses I did not possess, sustaining her in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The third cut, the fourth, the fifth, each one placed with the care of a musician tuning an instrument, adjusting tension, seeking resonance. She varied pressure, angle, depth, and I understood I was being mapped. She was learning what my body could endure, what sounds each type of pain produced, building a comprehensive understanding of my tolerances and limits, not to avoid crossing them, but to know exactly how to approach them with maximum effect. I tried to pray, tried to hold the Emperor's face in my mind, the litanies I had memorized in training, the promises that faith would be shield and sword both. But the words came apart in my mouth like paper in water, losing coherence, becoming just sounds without meaning. Where was he? Where was the golden light, the psychic protection that every guardsman was promised? The chamber felt empty of divinity, a void where faith went to die quietly and unmourned. She paused her work, setting down one instrument and selecting another. This one curved like a question mark, barbed like regret. She held it where I could see it, watching my eyes widen, observing fear as a distinct flavor separate from pain. And in that moment, I felt something flow from me to her, invisible but undeniable, and watched her become more vibrant, more present, more real while I diminished. This was not interrogation. There had been no questions, no demands for intelligence or codes or strategic information. My knowledge was worthless to them because knowledge was not what they required. This was introduction, initiation, the beginning of a process that had no endpoint except the eventual exhaustion of my capacity to suffer. The understanding crashed over me like cold void water. Every naive hope I had clutched in the darkness of the ship's hold was a lie I had told myself for comfort. No rescue was coming. The Imperium did not know where I was, could not reach into this place even if they did. The God Emperor, if he watched at all, watched from a distance so vast as to render his attention meaningless. This chamber existed outside the boundaries of his light, in a space that predated human empire and would outlast it. She resumed her work with renewed focus, and I finally screamed, properly screamed, the sound tearing from my throat like something with its own desperate life. She smiled then, not with cruelty, but with satisfaction, the expression of someone who has successfully completed a difficult calibration. She made more notations, her fingers dancing across her organic interface, recording the exact pitch and duration and timbre of my breaking. I was not a prisoner of war. War had rules, conventions, the possibility of exchange or execution or escape. Was livestock, valuable only for what could be harvested from my suffering, to be maintained at optimal productivity for as long as my body and mind could sustain the extraction. And when I was finally emptied, used up, screamed out, I would be discarded or recycled or repurposed into something else entirely. The work continued. The measurements accumulated, and in the semi-transparent walls around us, I thought I saw shadows moving, other chambers, other victims, other songs being extracted from flesh and fear in an endless symphony of agony that was this city's heartbeat, its economy, its reason for existing. She leaned close, breath cold on my bloodied skin, and whispered something in a tone almost gentle, almost kind. I did not need translation to understand. This was only the beginning. Time stopped meaning anything coherent in the days or weeks or months that followed. Komarag exists in perpetual false night, no sun to mark cycles, no natural rhythm to anchor consciousness. I was moved between stations of suffering like a product on an assembly line, each stop designed to refine me, to extract specific qualities, to prepare me for purposes I could not yet fathom. Between sessions, they kept us in holding cages, not cells, but cages, the distinction important because cells imply privacy and walls, while cages offer only bars and exposure and the constant awareness of being observed. I shared these spaces with other captives, and it was here, in the brief pauses between torments, that I began to understand the true scope of this place's horror. There was a woman from a world she called Vangelis, though she could no longer remember if that was the planet's name or her own. She sat in the corner of our cage, rocking slowly, whispering prayers to the Emperor in a voice like wind through broken machinery. The prayers had degraded over time. She had forgotten the proper words, and now just repeated sounds that approximated liturgy, phonetic echoes of faith without the meaning. Sometimes she would stop mid-prayer and laugh, high and brittle, before resuming the sacred sounds that no longer reached anywhere. There was a man named Cade who had been a pit fighter on some frontier world before his capture. He had survived 18 sessions with the Wychers. He counted them obsessively, carved marks into his own forearm with a sliver of metal he had hidden. 18 times into the arenas, 18 times returned alive if not intact. He explained to me, with the patient tone of a teacher instructing a slow student, that the key was to fight well enough to be entertaining, but never well enough to be threatening. Give them a show, he said. Make them feel something when they watch you bleed. Bore them and you're finished. Impress them too much and you become a problem to be eliminated. There's a narrow channel between those two deaths, and you learn to navigate it, or you disappear. There was a creature I could not identify, possibly human, once, possibly Xenos, now so extensively modified that biology had become abstract. It did not speak but made sounds like grinding metal, and the others avoided it except for an old man. A preacher, perhaps, or someone who had once been a preacher, who would sit beside it and speak gently about forgiveness and redemption until guards came to take one of them away. I learned from these fragmentary people. Learned that some had been here for years, that time could be endured if you surrendered the idea of escape and focused only on the next hour, the next moment. Learned that madness was not weakness, but adaptation. The mind protecting itself by abandoning rationality in favor of whatever internal landscape could be endured. learned that prayers to gods outside the webway fell into an abyss of silence, but some prayed anyway, because the act itself was all they had left of their former selves. They moved me to different torturers, and I began to perceive the methodology beneath the cruelty. Each one had a philosophy, an aesthetic, a particular approach they had refined over centuries of practice. The first torturer had been interested in precision, clean cuts, measured responses, the geometry of pain. But there was another, a male witch with ritual scars covering every visible inch of skin, who preferred improvisation. He would select instruments at random and discover what they could do. Jazz musician of agony, finding unexpected harmonies in my screaming. His sessions felt chaotic, but I came to understand they were not. He was exploring, innovating, pushing boundaries to discover new territories of suffering that had not yet been mapped. A homunculus came for me once, silent and terrible, body a manifesto of self-modification that had long ago transcended any pretense of natural form. It did not torture for sustenance like the Wyches, but for art, for the pure intellectual exercise of seeing what flesh could become when freed from the constraints of original design. It made adjustments to my nervous system, small changes, experimental, embedding things that would amplify sensations or redirect pain pathways, or make colors taste like burning. When it finished, it regarded its work with the satisfied expression of a sculptor stepping back from a challenging piece, then returned me to the cages without explanation. I began to understand the hierarchy of this place through observation and overheard fragments. The witches who performed in arenas, who had elevated combat and torture to performance art, sustained by the crowd's vicarious pleasure. The homunculi who reshaped flesh as canvas and statement, artists of biology unbound by morality or mercy. The archons who ruled through calculated terror, maintaining power by being more ruthless, more creative, more terrifying than any rival. And the incubi, silent warriors in ornate armor who served as executioners and bodyguards, speaking only through violence, perfection distilled to its lethal essence. Each encounter taught me new dimensions of helplessness. There was no defense against beings who had spent millennia perfecting their craft. No stoicism that could not be broken. No mental fortress that could not be breached. No technique of endurance that they had not already encountered and developed countermeasures for. I was an instrument they knew how to play better than I knew myself. But I noticed something disturbing. I was adapting. My mind was developing strategies without my conscious permission. I learned to pace my screaming, to save strength for when resistance might matter, to identify which torturers responded to defiance and which preferred submission. I learned to retreat into memory during the worst moments, to compartmentalize pain into something observed rather than experienced, to fragment my consciousness into pieces that could be hidden away where agony could not quite reach them. Cade noticed this change and warned me one night in the cage, his voice urgent and afraid. "You think you're learning to survive," he said, "but you're learning to be what they want you to be. Every adaptation makes you more valuable, more interesting, more worth keeping alive. The ones who break quickly get discarded. The ones who endure become long-term projects. You're building your own prison and calling it survival." I wanted to deny it, but I felt the truth of his words settling into the places where my faith used to live. I was changing, and the change was not damage but evolution. Terrible, necessary evolution into something that could exist in this environment. I was learning the architecture of pain, memorizing its rooms and corridors, and with each lesson, I became less the person I had been, and more the thing they were teaching me to become. The woman from Vangelis stopped mid-prayer and looked at me with sudden, horrible clarity. You still think there's a you to save, she said. That's the last thing they'll take. The woman's words haunted me through the next phase, which began when they brought me to a chamber deeper in whatever structure held us. This room was different, clinical where the others had been theatrical, surgical where they had been artistic. The homunculus who waited there was not the same one I had encountered in the market, but they shared that quality of having transcended original form so completely that Eldari was merely their species of origin, not their current state of being. It gestured with appendages that branched like decision trees, and I was strapped to a table that adjusted itself to my body, learning my shape, becoming custom-fitted restraint. The creature spoke in that glass-breaking voice, and though I still understood no words, I grasped the meaning through demonstration. It held up devices, organic and mechanical hybridized into singular purpose, and showed me where they would go. The first modification was embedded in the nerve cluster at the base of my skull. I felt it burrow in, felt it send tendrils along pathways that connected spine to brain, felt it integrate with systems I had never consciously controlled. When it activated, pain became something new, not diminished, but amplified, clarified, made high definition. Every sensation gained texture and complexity I had never imagined possible. A simple touch now contained multitudes, pressure, temperature, the specific friction coefficient of skin on skin, the microscopic tears in tissue, the chemical cascade of nerve signals translated into experience so vivid it was nearly hallucinogenic. The homunculus observed my reaction with satisfaction, making notations on its own flesh where symbols appeared and faded like temporary tattoos. It explained something, lecturing perhaps, or simply thinking aloud. Then began the second modification. My left eye. It held the eye open with instruments that bypassed my ability to blink, then introduced something living into the socket. I felt it wrap around the optic nerve, felt it merge with the eye itself, rewriting the organ's fundamental purpose. When it finished and removed the restraints, I could not close that eye anymore. It had been modified to remain perpetually open, perpetually receiving. The world through that eye was different. I saw in spectrums I had no names for, saw heat and cold as color, saw the psychic resonance of suffering as visible light that pulsed and flowed through the city's architecture. The other captives in nearby cages glowed with it, their pain made luminous, and I understood with sick clarity that this was how the dark Eldar saw the world, as a landscape painted in agony, every surface rich with the harvest they required. The modifications had not just changed my body, they had forced me to perceive reality through their aesthetic lens, to see beauty in what should have been horror. The third modification was embedded in my chest, near the heart. A regenerative symbiote, the homunculus's instruments suggested through pantomime. It would heal me rapidly, keep me functional, prevent death or permanent damage from interfering with the long-term project I was becoming. I felt it activate, felt wounds from previous sessions begin to close, not painlessly, but efficiently, the healing process itself a new source of sensation for the nerve amplifiers to catalog and transmit. I was returned to the cages changed, and the others noticed immediately. Cade looked at my modified eye and stepped back, crossing himself in the Imperial Aquila before remembering such gestures meant nothing here. "They're investing in you," he said quietly. "That means they expect a return. You just became expensive." The moral tests began shortly after. They were not presented as tests. The Dark Eldar were too sophisticated for such obvious framing, but as opportunities, choices, situations where we were forced to reveal ourselves through action rather than declaration. They brought a man to our cage, someone new, still fresh with the shock of capture, still believing rescue might come. A witch appeared and made an offer through gestures and expressions clear enough. Betray this man's location during the next arena selection, point him out specifically, and I would have one day without pain. One full rotation of timelessness without being touched, without being taken, without being used. I watched others face similar choices. The woman from Vangelis was given the option to fight another captive in a small arena for extra rations. Just enough food to ease the constant hunger, not enough to matter in the long term, but enough to make the body cry out for it. She accepted. I watched her bludgeon a man whose name I never learned, watched her weeping while she did it, watched her eat the extra ration with hands that shook, and I judged her. Told myself I would never break like that, never surrender principle for such meager reward. But I felt the hunger myself, felt my body's betrayal, its animal need for sustenance override higher reasoning, felt the exhaustion of constant pain wearing down the places where conviction lived. Cade was offered a modification, a mutation that would make him faster, stronger, give him genuine advantage in the arena fights he was forced into. The cost was subtle. His hands would change, fingers elongating into something between human and Xenos, a visible marker that he had chosen survival over humanity. He refused the first time, the second time. The third time I saw him staring at his hands in the darkness of the cage, flexing fingers that were merely human, merely vulnerable, and I knew the refusal was weakening. The fresh captive looked at me with desperate hope, still believing in brotherhood, in imperial solidarity, in the idea that humans would protect each other against Xenos' horrors. My modified eye saw him glowing with untapped suffering, rich with potential harvest, valuable in ways my original vision would never have perceived. The temptation rose like bile. One day without pain. Just one day to remember what it felt like to exist without agony. Just one small betrayal of someone I did not know, whose name meant nothing, who would suffer regardless of my choice. I did not betray him. Not that time. But I felt how close I came. Felt the calculation happening in parts of my mind that used to house integrity. Felt myself becoming the kind of person who weighs such choices seriously rather than rejecting them immediately. That was when I understood the true sophistication of their method. They were not trying to break us quickly. Quick breaks produced inferior product, flat notes, crude screams without complexity. They were connoisseurs, vintners of suffering who understood that the finest agonies required time, required the slow collapse of moral structure, required us to participate in our own destruction through 10,000 small choices that eroded who we were until nothing remained but the raw need to endure. The homunculus had not modified me to make torture more efficient. It had modified me to make my eventual breaking more exquisite, to ensure that when I finally surrendered everything I believed I was, the fall would be deep enough and slow enough to savor every meter of the descent. The fresh captive disappeared into an arena 3 days later, or 3 weeks, or 3 hours, time having long since lost its shape, and I never learned whether my silence had saved him or merely delayed the inevitable. I was still contemplating this when they came for me, but not the usual escorts. These were incubi, silent warriors in armor so ornate it became architecture, and their presence meant something different, something that made even the veteran captives in our cage go still and watchful. They brought me to a chamber that was not a torture room, but something closer to a throne room, if thrones could be carved from crystallized screams and upholstered in the flayed dignity of civilizations. The space was vast, walls rising into darkness that my modified eye read as layers of compressed suffering, centuries of harvest stored in the structure itself, and at the center, elevated on a dais of what might have been bone or might have been stone, it was difficult to tell, and perhaps the distinction no longer mattered, sat the Archon. I knew what it was immediately, though I had never seen one before. There is a quality to beings who have survived millennia, who have fed on the pain of millions, who have refined cruelty into philosophy, and philosophy into art, and art into the fundamental principle of their continued existence. The Archon was ancient in ways that made my modified eye ache, radiating layers of experience that human perception could barely process. Beautiful, yes. They were all beautiful, but beauty so cold and perfect it had passed through aesthetics into pure mathematics, the geometric proof of what happens when survival becomes the only virtue. It spoke, and I understood. Not the language, that remained alien glass-breaking melody, but the meaning arrived directly in my mind. Translation courtesy of some technology or psychic capability I could not identify. "You pray," the Archon said, and it was not a question. "Even now, in this place where gods do not reach, you whisper to your corpse emperor. I am curious, does faith persist from conviction or merely from habit?" I said nothing, throat too dry for speech, mind reeling from the shock of being addressed rather than simply used. "You may speak," it continued, leaning forward with the focused attention of a scholar approaching a particularly interesting specimen. "I have fed on your pain for weeks now, tasted the flavor of your breaking, and I find there is complexity beneath the screaming. You cling to something even as everything else dissolves. I wish to understand what that something is before I take it from you." "The Emperor protects," I managed, the words automatic, catechism drilled so deep it emerged without conscious thought. The Archon's expression did not change, but I felt its amusement like radiation, warming my modified nerve clusters into new configurations of discomfort. "Does he? You are here. Your world burns. Your comrades died quickly if they were fortunate. Where is this protection you claim?" "Faith is tested in darkness," I said, reciting liturgy because original thought had abandoned me. "The righteous endure. The Emperor's light reaches nowhere that matters," the Archon interrupted, not unkindly. "Your scripture is poetry, human. Beautiful poetry, I admit, refined through millennia of revision, but poetry nonetheless. Let me offer you something more substantial. Truth." It rose, descended from the dais with movements too fluid to track properly, and stood close enough that I could see my reflection in its armor, see myself distorted and small and already barely recognizable. "We are Eldari," it said. "Once we ruled galaxies. We built wonders your species cannot comprehend with technologies your Mechanicus would worship as divine. We achieved heights of civilization, art, philosophy, pleasure that made reality itself insufficient. And in our perfection, we birthed a god." The Archon's voice carried weight that was not volume, each word settling into my consciousness like stones into deep water. "She who thirsts, the great enemy, the prince of pleasure whose birth scream tore our civilization into ash and consumed billions of our souls in an instant of eternal damnation. We created her through our excess, our refinement, our absolute mastery of every sensation existence could provide. We became so perfect in our pleasures that we manifested a deity whose hunger for our souls is infinite." I knew fragments of this history, imperial propaganda about the fall of the Eldar, warnings about Xenos corruption, but hearing it described from inside the experience was different, more terrible. "So we chose," the Archon continued. "We could surrender to she who thirsts, allow her to slowly drain our souls from birth until death claims us, or we could feed. We could do to others what she would do to us, harvest the suffering of lesser beings and use that torment to sate her hunger, to keep our souls intact for one more day, one more century, One more millennium. This is not cruelty, human. This is survival. We torture you so that we ourselves are not tortured by a god we accidentally created. Every scream you produce is one less piece of my soul consumed by eternal damnation. The revelations settled into me like poison, changing the chemistry of my understanding. They were not evil for evil's sake. They were damned things, clinging to existence through an endless harvest of agony, trapped in a hell of their own making with no possibility of redemption or escape, only the eternal choice between victimizing others or being victimized by something worse. Somehow, this made it more horrible, not less. But here is what truly disturbs your faith, the Archon said, leaning closer, voice dropping to something almost intimate. Your Imperium does the same. You grind entire worlds to dust for your corpse god. You sacrifice billions to maintain his rotting throne. You burn heretics not for justice but for fuel, feed psychers to his eternal hunger, turn human beings into servitors and cherubs and components in a machine that has forgotten why it was built. You speak of righteousness while standing on mountains of your own species' corpses. The only difference between us, human, is that we are honest about our cruelty. We do not pretend that torture serves a higher purpose. We do not call our victims blessed for the privilege of their suffering. I wanted to deny it, wanted to argue that the Imperium's brutality served necessity, that humanity's survival justified any cost, that the God Emperor's vision transcended mere morality. But the words died in my throat, killed by the weight of things I had seen on Hadris Prime. The servitor who still had human eyes that tracked movement with horrible awareness. The penal legions driven into minefields to clear them with their bodies. The tithe collectors who measured populations in acceptable losses. You understand now, the Archon said, and its smile was the saddest thing I had seen in this place of infinite sadness. We are mirrors, your Imperium and my Comora. Both empires built on suffering, both sustained by grinding lesser beings into fuel, both utterly convinced of our own necessity. The only honest difference is that we have better aesthetics. The crack that had been forming in my certainty split wide open, and through it poured questions I could not answer, parallels I could not deny, a darkness that was not the absence of the Emperor's light, but the possibility that such light had never existed at all, or worse, that it existed but was not meaningfully different from the darkness I now inhabited. The Archon's words followed me back to the cages like a second modification, one that lived in my mind rather than my flesh. The others noticed the change immediately, not in my body, which bore no new scars from that encounter, but in my eyes, the human one and the modified one both. Cade looked at me and said nothing, but his expression held recognition. He had been where I was now, standing in the place where certainty ends and the terrible questions begin. 3 days later, or perhaps it was 3 hours, or 3 years, time having become a concept I experienced rather than measured, they came for me again. Not the incubi this time, but a representative of a homunculus coven, its robes adorned with anatomical diagrams of species I could not name, each one meticulously labeled in script that hurt my modified eye to observe. It examined me with instruments that grew from its fingers, then made a gesture I recognized from the market. Purchase completed, property transferred. I had been sold. Selected for a long-term project, the laboratory where they brought me was vast and terrible in its organization. Specimens floated in cylindrical tanks, some still screaming though their lungs had been replaced with filtration systems, some transformed so extensively that biology had become abstract art. The homunculus who owned me now, and I understood with absolute clarity that I was owned, that personhood had been redesignated as property, regarded me the way a sculptor regards marble, seeing not what is, but what could be. The modifications that followed were not the careful, clinical adjustments of before. These were extensive, transformative, each one rewriting my fundamental architecture. They replaced sections of my skeleton with materials that were lighter and stronger, embedding reactive fibers that could harden on impact or flex beyond human limits. My remaining natural eye was augmented to match the modified one, granting me their full spectrum of vision, and with it, the curse of seeing the world as they saw it, every surface painted in gradients of suffering. My muscle tissue was threaded with synthetic strands that amplified strength while accelerating recovery. Pain receptors were redistributed, relocated, some removed entirely while others were concentrated in specific zones, turning my body into an instrument that could be played with greater precision. They embedded something in my brain. I felt it burrow through the blood-brain barrier, felt it establish connections with memory centers and emotional processing regions. And after that, things began to blur. My home world. I tried to remember its name. Hadris Prime, yes, that was it. Or was it? The certainty wavered. Had I said Hadris Prime or Hadrax Secundus? Or had it been something else entirely? A name that started differently, ended differently, meant something I could no longer quite grasp. I reached for the memory and found it had edges now, places where it had been subtly edited, revised, made uncertain. Faces followed. My mother's features, once so clear I could have drawn them in the dust, now blurred at the edges. My father. Had I had a father? The memory insisted I must have, but the actual image refused to coalesce. Friends from training, from the guard, from the life I insisted I had lived before this place. They became generic, sketch outlines of human connection without the specific details that made them real, made them mine. I tried to pray, opened my mouth and began the litany of protection, words I had recited 10,000 times and found them coming apart like wet paper. The Emperor protects. But what came next? From the darkness. No, that was not right. In his name, we... The structure collapsed, leaving only phonetic sounds, sacred noise without the meaning that made it prayer. I was speaking in tongues, but there was no divinity to interpret them, just the echo of catechism becoming gibberish. The most terrible thing, there were moments of beauty in this descent. The modifications made me faster, stronger, more aware than I had ever been. I could move in ways that would have been impossible before, my enhanced body responding to thought with the precision of machinery. My expanded vision revealed layers of reality I had never suspected, patterns in chaos, mathematics in suffering, an aesthetic coherence to the dark Eldar's cruelty that was undeniably elegant. Pain, which had once been only agony, became a language I could read. I understood the nuance now, could distinguish between types and sources, could predict what would come next based on subtle variations in pressure and temperature and nerve activation. I was becoming functional in hell, and functionality felt disturbingly like achievement. I watched others in the laboratory reach their endpoints. Some went mad, their minds finally surrendering to impossibility and retreating into internal spaces that could not be tortured. Some achieved a kind of Zen acceptance, becoming so hollow that suffering passed through them without purchase. Some raged until they were discarded as spoiled product, no longer capable of producing the refined agonies their owners desired. But some, and this was the most disturbing observation, some simply stopped resisting, not from weakness, but from the exhaustion of fighting an unwinnable battle. They adapted. They found ways to exist within the horror. They became fluent in the language of their captivity and used that fluency to survive one more day, one more modification, one more session where their body was used as medium for someone else's art. I understood now why Cade had warned me. Every strategy I developed, every adaptation I made, every moment I survived by becoming more compatible with this environment, I was collaborating in my own transformation. Survival itself was the trap. Then came the choice. They brought another captive to the laboratory, young, fresh, still possessing the clarity I had lost. The homunculus indicated through its translator symbiote that I could assist in the preparation, hold the captive down during the initial modifications, restrain them when they struggled, provide the practical knowledge of human anatomy that would make the process more efficient. In exchange, reduced sessions for myself, better rations, perhaps even the removal of one of the more painful augmentations I carried. The captive looked at me with eyes that still remembered hope, still believed in the brotherhood of shared humanity, still trusted that one human would protect another against Xeno's horror. I knew what I should do, knew what Guardsman Third Class Victor Mizan from Hadris Prime, or whatever world I had actually come from, would have done, knew what the Emperor demanded of his faithful, what honor required, what remaining shreds of my former self screamed at me to choose. I held the captive down, positioned the restraints, provided the anatomical information the homunculus requested, and when the cutting began and the screaming started, I did not look away because my modified eyes no longer had the mercy of closure. The line I swore I would never cross disappeared behind me, and I could not remember when exactly I had stepped over it, or whether stepping back was even possible anymore. The captive I helped restrain did not survive the modifications. Not physically. They were kept alive in the technical sense, organs functioning, nerves transmitting, but something essential broke during the process, and what remained was a shell that breathed and bled, but no longer registered as human in any way that mattered. The homunculus discarded them with the disappointed gesture of an artist who had ruined promising material through over-eager application of technique. I felt nothing watching this. That was when I knew how far I had fallen. My reward for collaboration was transfer. The homunculus sold me to a witch cult, and I understood through the fragments of their language. I had begun to comprehend that I had been reclassified. No longer raw material for laboratory work, but refined product ready for performance. They brought me to the arena districts, where the architecture itself seemed designed to amplify screaming, where every surface was positioned to provide optimal viewing angles for the crowds that gathered to feed on spectacle. The holding pens beneath the arenas were packed with others like me, modified, trained, prepared for the entertainment of beings whose appetite for suffering had been honed across millennia. I recognized Cade immediately, though he had changed since I last saw him in the cages. His refusal had finally broken. His hands were no longer human, fingers elongated into something between natural and weaponized, joints reinforced, nails hardened into claws. He would not meet my eyes. There was a woman whose name I never learned, her entire skeletal structure replaced with something that could compress and expand, allowing her to move in ways that defied anatomy. There was a man who had been given venomous glands, his body turned into a weapon that would kill him as surely as it killed his opponents, just more slowly. There were dozens of us, each one a project completed, each one a transformation that could not be reversed. An old fighter, scarred so extensively that his original features were archaeologically buried, explained the system in a voice like grinding stone. You fight. You survive or you don't. If you survive well, entertain them, make them feel something. You fight again. If you bore them, you're culled. If you die too quickly, you waste their investment. If you refuse to fight, they have ways of making refusal impossible. There is no winning, only postponing. I asked the question that had been growing in my mind like a tumor. Has anyone ever escaped? He looked at me with something that might have been pity. Escape to where? We're in the webway, in a city older than your Imperium, surrounded by beings who have spent thousands of years perfecting the prevention of escape. Even if you somehow reach the edges, where would you go? Back through passages you don't understand to a galaxy that has forgotten you. This is forever, boy. The sooner you accept that, the longer you'll last. Forever. The words settled into my modified bones and found purchase. I would never leave Comora, would never see the light of a real sun again, never feel atmospheric wind that was not recycled through ancient machinery, never stand on soil that had not been processed through the digestive systems of a city that ate worlds. My death, when it came, would not be clean, would not be the honest death of a guardsman falling in righteous battle, would not earn me even a footnote in the Munitorum's casualty reports. I would die here, in darkness, for the entertainment of creatures who would forget me before my body cooled. The awareness was crushing in its totality. Not the sharp pain of torture, but the dull weight of absolute certainty, the mathematical proof that hope was irrational, and faith was delusion, and everything I had believed about meaning and purpose was architecture built on nothing. Around me, others reached their endpoints in different ways. A woman began laughing during the pre-fight preparations and could not stop, the sound rising in pitch until guards dragged her away to be discarded or repurposed. A man achieved a state of perfect stillness, eyes open but seeing nothing, having retreated so far into internal space that his body was abandoned territory. Another raged, screaming curses in a language I did not recognize until his voice failed and they removed him for making unsatisfactory noise. I watched these different forms of surrender and understood I was approaching my own. That night, or what passed for night in a place without true darkness or true light, I attempted one final act of spiritual resistance. In the corner of the holding pen, pressed against walls that were still warm from the previous day's arena combat, I tried to pray. Emperor of mankind, I whispered, Lord of the Imperium, Master of the Golden Throne. But the words felt like sounds in a dead language, phonetic sequences that once carried power but now meant nothing. I am Victor. Was that my name? Victor? Or had it been something else? Something I could no longer quite remember. Of what world? Your faithful servant. The prayer disintegrated like ash in my mouth. I could not remember the proper litanies, could not reconstruct the catechisms, could not find the faith that had once lived in the space where my certainty used to be. The Emperor, if he existed, if he watched, if he cared, was so distant that his light was not even a memory, just the theoretical possibility of illumination in an infinite darkness. I tried to remember who I had been, tried to hold my true name, my real face, the person I was before the modifications and the choices and the collaborations and the slow dissolution of everything that made me human. But that person felt fictional now, a character I had played convincingly but never truly been, a mask that had been worn so long I could no longer remember the face beneath it. I will remember, I promised myself, though I could not specify what I was promising to remember. I will not forget. But forget what? The specifics had already gone, leaving only the shape of loss, the awareness that something important had been present once, and was present no longer. Cade sat down beside me, his modified hands flexing unconsciously. It doesn't help, he said quietly. The praying, the remembering, the promises, they're just ways of prolonging the pretense that there's something left to save. Then why do you still do it? I asked, because I had seen his lips moving in the darkness, forming words to gods or memories or the ghost of who he used to be. Because even pretense is something, he said. Even hollow ritual is better than the absolute nothing that comes after you stop. Tomorrow they would take me to the arena. Tomorrow I would fight or perform or die or survive, and the cycle would repeat and repeat and repeat until I joined the laughing woman or the empty-eyed man or the ones who raged against the mathematical certainty of their damnation. I was documenting my own extinction, bearing witness to the death of everything I had been, and the only audience was the darkness that had no interest in testimony or truth, or the small tragedy of one human becoming less than human in a place where humanity itself was just another resource to be harvested and consumed. The last prayer died unfinished on my lips, and in the silence that followed, I heard only the breathing of other doomed things, and the distant sounds of crowds gathering for tomorrow's entertainment, and the steady rhythm of a city that would outlast every fragile thing inside it. They came for me when the crowds had gathered, when the feeding hunger of thousands of dark Eldar had reached critical mass, when the psychic pressure of their anticipation made the air itself feel thick and expectant. The handlers fitted me with minimal armor, not protection but decoration, something to make the violence more aesthetic when it came. They gave me weapons, simple blades designed to prolong combat rather than end it efficiently, tools meant to produce interesting deaths rather than quick ones. The arena floor was bone. Not metaphorically, I could see with my modified vision the cellular structure, could identify the species it had come from, could trace the age of the killing that had produced this smooth, pale surface. Thousands of years old, this floor, polished by blood and maintained through processes I did not want to imagine. The stands rose in impossible angles around me, packed with spectators whose beauty was violence and whose attention was consumption itself. My opponent entered from the opposite gate. They had given me another human. Mercy, perhaps, or simply the aesthetic choice of watching two of the same species destroy each other. He was younger than me, less modified, still possessed enough of his original face that I could see the terror living there. They had given him weapons too, and in his eyes I saw the same calculation I had made dozens of times in the holding pens. Survive this fight, earn one more day, postpone the inevitable. The crowd's hunger pressed down like atmospheric pressure. I felt them feeding already, drawing sustenance from our fear, from the anticipation of pain, from the knowledge that we would hurt each other because the alternative was dying alone and boring them in the process. The signal came, a sound like breaking crystal, a light that meant begin, and my body moved before my mind could object. The modifications took over, the enhanced reflexes and augmented strength and all the adjustments that had been made to turn me into functional entertainment. I was faster than he was, more experienced, better refined. My blade found his shoulder, opened a wound that was deep enough to matter but shallow enough to prolong the engagement. He screamed, and the crowd's attention sharpened, focused, drew the sound from him and fed on it like sustenance. I felt them becoming more present, more vibrant, more real with each note of his agony. I could kill him quickly. My modifications gave me that option. But I knew, had learned through observation and instruction and the slow education of captivity, that quick deaths were wasteful. Quick deaths bored the connoisseurs in the stands, and boring them meant my own value decreased, meant I became disposable, meant the next fight would be my last. So I prolonged it, made cuts that hurt but did not cripple, gave him opportunities to strike back, to hope, to believe he might survive if he fought hard enough. Each exchange was choreography I had not consciously learned but somehow knew. The dance of entertaining violence, the performance of suffering elevated to craft. He wounded me, a slash across my ribs that my regenerative augments began healing immediately, but not so fast that the crowd couldn't appreciate the blood, couldn't feed on the moment of my pain intersecting with his triumph. I heard myself cry out, heard the sound amplified by the arena's acoustic design, and felt the crowd draw it in, savor it, convert it into whatever currency sustained their damned existence. The fight continued. Minutes or hours, I could not tell. We carved each other into art for their consumption, and with each exchange I felt myself becoming less the person who had entered and more the thing they needed me to be. Not a warrior fighting for survival. Warriors have causes, principles, reasons beyond continuation. I was becoming pure function, a mechanism designed to produce optimal suffering, my identity irrelevant except as substrate for the performance. Then came the moment. I had him down, blade at his throat, the kill available and expected. The crowd's anticipation reached a pitch that was almost sexual. Thousands of beings waiting for the conclusion, for the final scream, for the death that would complete the transaction. My hand steadied, my blade pressed against vulnerable flesh, and I looked into his eyes and saw not an enemy but a mirror, not an opponent but another version of myself, not a stranger but the person I had been before I learned to calculate the value of prolonging suffering. I could not do it. Not because of mercy. Mercy had been excised from me through modification and experience and the slow dissolution of everything soft. I could not do it because I understood, with absolute and crushing clarity, that killing him changed nothing. Sparing him changed nothing. Victory was not victory. Defeat was not defeat. Survival was not survival. All of it was just continuation. Just more of the same eternal grinding. Just the postponement of an ending that would come regardless and mean nothing when it did. The blade fell from my hand. Not dropped, placed. Deliberately set down on the bone floor that had drunk the blood of 10,000 fighters before me and would drink 10,000 more after I was gone. The crowd's confusion rippled through the arena like a psychic wave. This was not protocol. This was not entertainment. This was not giving them what they had gathered to consume. And in that moment of their displeasure, I stopped screaming. Not physically, no sound had been coming from my throat, but internally, in the place where resistance lived, in the machinery of the soul that had been crying out against this reality since the moment of my capture. I stopped, not because the pain had ended. The pain was eternal, was atmospheric, was the fundamental state of existence in this place. I stopped screaming because I accepted it, accepted that this was permanent, that meaning was arbitrary, that identity was a fiction I had been maintaining through effort that no longer seemed worth expending. Survival was all that remained, not as goal, but as fact, not as choice, but as the simple continuation of biological processes that had not yet decided to terminate. There was a terrible transcendence in this acceptance. I understood now what the Dark Eldar had always known, that meaning must be created from meaninglessness, that identity must be carved from flesh when spirit fails, that existence without purpose is still existence, and existence itself is neither good nor evil, just the state of ongoing. I was not victor anymore, was not guardsman, was not imperial, was not even fully human. I was a thing that continued, that performed functions, that existed in the space between life and death without belonging to either category. The self I had been trying to preserve had already died, perhaps weeks ago, perhaps in the first moment of the homunculus's modifications, perhaps in the instant I held down another captive and called it survival. Handlers entered the arena, removed me and my opponent both, neither winner nor loser, because those categories no longer applied. The crowd dispersed, unsatisfied, and I felt nothing about their disappointment. Felt nothing about anything except the simple fact of continuation. The next moment arriving after this one, and the next, and the next. Each one indistinguishable from the last, each one empty of meaning or purpose, or the hope that anything would ever change. This was the death of the self, and I witnessed it from inside, and the witnessing was all that remained when everything else had been extracted, refined, and consumed by a city that would outlast memory itself. They kept me after that day in the arena, not as punishment for my failure to complete the performance, but as curiosity, as a specimen of something they had not seen before, a captive who had broken in an interesting direction, who had found acceptance instead of resistance, who had transformed not into rage or madness, but into something closer to their own philosophy of meaningless continuation. Time passed. I do not know how much. Months became years, became something beyond years. Duration without measurement, existence without markers to distinguish one moment from the next. I fought when they required it, performed when they demanded it, submitted to modifications when new homunculi purchased shares of my continuing project. My body changed further, became less human with each adjustment, until I could no longer remember what my original form had looked like, or whether it mattered that I had forgotten. I am speaking to you now from a place beyond the story's main action, from a distance measured not in time but in transformations, from a perspective that has survived impossibly long in a city that was never designed for human endurance. I have become something between victim and resident, between captive and citizen, between the tortured and the one who understands why torture exists here as fundamental principle rather than aberration. The darkness I described at the beginning, the absolute darkness of the ship's hold, the texture of nothing pressing against my eyes. I still live in that darkness. It never ended. Comora exists in eternal false night, and I have learned that this darkness is not absence of light, but presence of something else, something that has replaced light in the spectrum of existence. The alien hands that touched my skin with that terrible curiosity still touch me, though now I understand their touch not as violation, but as assessment, not as cruelty, but as the clinical interest of beings who have made suffering into science and science into survival. The laughter I heard, that bright musical sound utterly devoid of joy, I still hear it echoing through the districts where I am taken, where I perform, where I continue. But I understand it differently now. It is not mockery, it is not celebration. It is the sound of beings who are themselves screaming, who have learned to transform their own eternal agony into something that sounds like pleasure, who have spent 10,000 years pretending that the hell they inhabit is paradise because the alternative is confronting the magnitude of their damnation. What was lost? Everything. Humanity, which was always more fragile than I believed. Faith, which dissolved the moment it encountered reality indifferent to its claims. Identity, which I learned was just a story I told myself, easily edited, readily replaced. Hope, which was never rational, and whose absence feels less like tragedy and more like clarity. The person I was, victor of some world whose name I can no longer quite remember, that person died so slowly, I never noticed the exact moment of death, only the accumulating evidence that he was no longer present in the flesh that still bore his scars. What was gained? Terrible knowledge. I understand now what the Archon tried to teach me, what the Dark Eldar know in their bones, what every being in Comora learns or dies ignorant. Meaning is not discovered, it is manufactured. Identity is not essential, it is performed. Survival is not virtue, it is simply the continuation of biological processes that have not yet ceased. There is a kind of dark wisdom in this understanding, a philosophy born from necessity, a truth that is honest even if it is not comforting. I gained fluency in the language of pain, literacy in the grammar of suffering, and the ability to exist in conditions that would have destroyed the person I used to be. What remains? less than nothing, or perhaps more. There is an echo of who I was, a ghost that haunts the modified flesh I inhabit, occasionally surfacing in moments when I remember to mourn what has been lost. But there is also something worse, the realization that some part of me has adapted, has learned to exist in hell, has become functional in conditions that should not permit function. I have learned to appreciate the aesthetic refinement of the tortures I witness, to admire the craftsmanship of the homunculi who reshape flesh with such precision, to feel something like satisfaction when I perform well in the arena and earn another day of existence that I neither want nor know how to refuse. If you are taken, and you might be taken, for the raids continue, for the dark Eldar's hunger never ceases, for chance does not care about your righteousness, or your prayers, or your belief that the Emperor protects. Know this: everything they told you about torture is wrong. It is not about information. It is not about punishment. It is not about breaking you quickly. It is about refinement, about the slow cultivation of exquisite suffering, about transforming you from crude material into perfected product. Resistance is not noble. It is just a slower path to the same destination. Faith will not save you. It will only make the journey more painful as you watch it dissolve. Hope is a luxury you will learn to surrender, because carrying it is more exhausting than accepting its absence. Know that you will change. Know that the changes will feel like adaptation, like survival, like necessary compromise, and you will not notice the moment when adaptation becomes collaboration, when survival becomes complicity, when compromise becomes the complete surrender of everything you believed was essential to your humanity. Know that there is no rescue, no escape, no redemption waiting in the final act. There is only continuation, the next moment, and the next, and the next, each one indistinguishable from the last, each one empty of the meaning you once believed existence required. I am still in darkness, as I was in the beginning, still surrounded by beings whose beauty is violence and whose attention is consumption, still feeling their hands on my modified flesh, still hearing their laughter that predates empires and will outlast any hope of salvation. But I understand now that this is not temporary imprisonment. This is eternity, or close enough to eternity that the distinction no longer matters. The horror does not end in Comora. It only transforms, finds new shapes, discovers fresh configurations of the same fundamental truth, that suffering is the city's architecture, its economy, its purpose, and everything within its boundaries exists to feed that purpose or be fed upon. I speak to you from the eternal night, from a place where gods do not reach, and hope is recognized as the delusion it always was. I speak as warning and as witness, as the voice of someone who survived by becoming something that should not survive, by learning to exist in conditions that should not permit existence. And tomorrow, or in the next moment that Comora decides is tomorrow, they will come for me again. The hands will touch, the laughter will echo, the performance will continue, and I will respond as I have learned to respond, as I have been taught through modification and experience and the slow death of the self, with acceptance, with function, with the terrible transcendence of understanding that this is all there is, all there has ever been, all there will ever be. The darkness presses close, patient and eternal, and I have learned to call it home.